So today we're going to throw a bottle on the pottery wheel. Bottles are sometimes what are considered a little more of a difficult form to make, but as long as you're careful and you don't put too much water on the clay, a bottle isn't that difficult. One of the biggest problems with bottles is that people use way too much water and the pots tend to collapse. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is center my clay on the wheel. When I'm centering it, sometimes I will pull up by coning and then back down. And this is just an additional step that kind of gets the clay to be a little more homogeneous. Okay. So now that I have my clay centered, I'll go ahead and put the hole in the middle. Now there's a lot of different shapes of bottles, and every bottle has a different shape. I'm just going to be throwing a bottle and talking generally about really the top of the bottle, but every bottle might have a few different moves. This is just kind of a guide for understanding how bottles are different than coffee cups or bowls or plates. So after I've opened the well, or sunk the well, then the next thing I'm going to do is widen the base. I'm going to pre-thin the top of my cylinder by squeezing a little bit in and making sure that my cylinder is thicker on the bottom, thinner on top when I start. And I'm going to raise a kind of tall, narrow cylinder. I'm going to make a narrower bottle. So as I raise it, I'm going to raise a few different ways so you can just see different hand positions. This is one way to raise. You always want to make sure the outside of your pot is shiny when you're raising. Same with the inside, not too much water. Second raise, I'm going to use my sponge and my fingers. On the third raise, I'll use my thumb on the outside with my hand upside down. All right. So now that I have a cylinder raised, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my flexible metal rib, and I'm going to clean up the outside and get the water off the outside. And one of the things that makes bottles a little bit easier is if I do the same thing on the inside. I hold the metal rib against the edge of my index finger, and I'm going to run the rib down the inside very lightly and remove some of that water as well. Okay. The reason I do that is because this is kind of the heavy part of the clay. It's the wet clay that kind of makes the cylinder soggy. And because I don't want this to collapse, I want to keep the cylinder as dry as possible during the next part, which is shaping the pot. So now that I have my cylinder, I'm going to give myself a few lines so I know where the neck of the bottle is going to start. So I'm going to leave from this line up for the neck of my bottle. I'm going to make a bottle that kind of has a little bit of a wide kind of fat bottom, and then it's going to have a narrow, tall top. Okay, very generic bottle shape. There's a few different ways I can shape the bottle. One, I can use my fingers. Because I dried the inside, I'm going to have dry fingers. My fingers can be on the inside with my rib on the outside. And I push against the rib very lightly, and I slowly go from the bottom to the top, making it a little bit wider, only up to that line. Or I can go from the top down, making it a little bit wider the same way. The important thing is that I move my hands very slowly and that I don't push too hard. Now, here's the part of the bottle that I think most people make a mistake with, and it's proportion. Proportionally, when you look at this pot as it is, you see that the width of the neck of my pot, which is this part here, is almost the same width as the body. So it doesn't look like this is too round. But you have to imagine when I color this in, this area of the pot is going to look a lot rounder than it is now. Now this is important to talk about because if I look at it just like this, I'm like, oh, this bottom part isn't as round as I want it. I'm gonna make it rounder. And you kind of push this out and inflate it. Well, the further out you push this, the more likely it is to collapse because you've got a cylinder sitting on top of like a sphere, and it's not a very strong structure. So if you want to make one of those shapes, it's not impossible, but you always want to keep in mind, as I start narrowing the neck of my bottle, proportionally, it's going to make the body of my bottle look rounder. It's going to look fuller and bigger. So I will use my rib on the inside now, how we do with the bowl, and I'm going to push just a little bit more out. This is another way to shape the bottle of the body of my bottle, or the belly. And now when you look at it, you say, okay, well, that doesn't look very round, but you're gonna see in a moment when I collar this part in and make the top narrower, this is going to look very wide and very round. It's gonna change proportionally, look larger because this goes in. I'm not gonna push on it anymore though. So when I'm collaring, I'm going to need some water. So I'll take my sponge and I'm gonna put water only where I need it. This is important for bottles too. I'm gonna try not to let any water touch this belly of my pot. This is the part that needs to stay firm and dry. So you can see it's dry here and it's wet up there. Okay, so I've got a nice wet neck. My hands are wet, and now we're going to collar the clay. So I'm going to take my hands, there's a lot of different ways to collar, but essentially I'm taking my hands and I'm going to squeeze the clay inward, and the clay is going to become narrower. As it becomes narrower, it does become a little thicker. One hand position I use is you can use a triangle, where you kind of have a triangle here and you're pushing with the edge of your finger on each side and your thumbs on one side. I start from the bottom here, I make my little triangle, I should see the top become triangular, and then I come up. That's a very simple way to collar. The way that I prefer to use is actually bending my index fingers in, and then I'm going to use 6 points of contact to collar the cylinder in, all on the same plane. So I'm going to be using my middle finger, the back of my index finger, and my thumb on both hands. So it's a very comfortable, relaxed position. You can just let your hands relax on the clay. You want them to not be angled up like this. I don't want to be touching the rim and the base at the same time. I want to be all in the same line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze in just a little bit, and then I'm going to come up. Now I just feel like I have more control this way, but it's good for you to try a few different ways and find out which way works best for you. And then I bring the top in. And you can see already by bringing this top in a little bit, this has become, or appears to be, getting rounder. Okay, it's not really. This top part is just getting narrower, and you're proportionally seeing this as larger because this is smaller or closed more. I'm going to be collaring it in some more, but after you collar 1 or 2 times, it's always a good idea, one, to put a little bit more water on the part you're collaring. I'll make sure I keep the water off of the shoulder of my bottle. It's a good habit. And I'm going to raise the neck of my pot a little bit, because every time that you collar it in, it actually gets a little thicker. So I want to thin this out so it doesn't get too thick. So I'm going to do a very light raise. I'm going to use one finger on the outside, my index finger, my middle finger on the inside, and do a little finger raise to make it a little taller. Now, one of the concerns or issues that you'll run into when you're trying to collar, if you've used too much water especially, is that this top will start to ripple. It's going to start to look like it's rippling around. So when you're collaring it, it's going to start to look like a flower on top. One way to avoid that is, as you're collaring it, if you're using your hands, however you want to use your hands, as you get closer to the top, you let your index fingers or your thumb kind of push down actually a little bit on the rim, and that's going to prevent the cylinder from wobbling as much. Okay, by holding the rim sturdy. So if my cylinder is wobbling, I'll take my index fingers, fold them over the top, and then continue to collar in. Now I've been coloring very slowly for the video. I'm going to actually color one more time, a little more aggressively, and I'm going to get this going in like a bottle. Okay, so I'm going to start from here. I'm going to squeeze in, just kind of how you raise, and then I'm going to squeeze in and lift up. And now as I go up, as I get to the top, I'm going to put my fingers over the top and squeeze in. So now I've got a nice shoulder. Look how round this looks now. Okay, that's the proportional difference. I didn't make that any wider, I just made the top narrower. I'm going to get that water off my shoulder again. Just like I did last time when I collared in, it does get a little thicker, so I'm going to raise this little cylinder that is my neck. And now from here, it's really up to me to decide how much more I want to go in. The bottom of this, I have some extra clay that I didn't raise. I'll take this off with my wood knife, but I am going to, one more time, kind of raise this, but it's kind of a collaring raise. So I could collar it like this and bring it in right there. But I'm actually going to use my thumb, how I raised it before, and push in with my thumb. That's going to actually make it narrower, and I'm going to kind of raise it as it gets narrower. Now, I'm going to have this top flare out a little bit. I could leave it narrow, but I kind of like this nice little flare that I've got. Maybe I'll leave a little bump up here, and we'll see how that looks, if I like how that looks. I have this shoulder here. I'm going to remove the water from there, and I want to constantly make sure I don't leave water on this area, which is called the shoulder. Okay. Removing some water. All right. Now, I have a lot of aesthetic decisions to make. If I wanted, I could define this neck by putting a little line. And now I have a defined neck where it changes directions from the ball part of the shoulder to the neck part of my pot. Or I could blend that and make it a nice smooth transition. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it just like that. This is just a bottle for demonstration. The next step I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the bottom clay with my wood knife. So I'm going to hold it like a pencil. I'm going to go right in at that corner. I have a lot of extra clay at the bottom for this one. Now I'm going to slowly go in and down. Okay. Now that I can hear it touch, I'll use my pen tool, cut underneath, and I will remove this excess clay. So if you rewound this video and you looked at how wide the body of the cylinder looked while the top was wide, it probably didn't look very round, but when you look at it now, it really has a nice full body, full belly. I'm going to remove just a little bit of that mud off. I'm going to clean up some of these transitions so they're nice and sharp. Okay. So that is my bottle shape. Now I'm going to cut this in half so you can see what it looks like on the inside. The bottom is going to be a little thin. I went a little too deep, but this is just for demonstration. But we're going to look at the thickness of the bottle so we can see how thick the sides are. Okay. So as we open this up, what you're going to notice is I did go a little too far down, which means I couldn't trim much of a foot there. But I have a wider base, and it slowly gets thinner as we go up to the neck, and it gets thinner here all the way up to the top. What I want to avoid is having any really thick spots here, because if my neck is too thick on my shoulder, it is going to start collapsing, and this is what's going to happen. It'll start weighing itself down, and then eventually your pot will sink. We avoid that by having it thicker at the bottom and gradually getting thinner all the way up. It's a difficult thing to do, but that's why it's nice to cut your pots in half. You can kind of look at it and say, how does this thing look? Did I get from thick to thin pretty well? And I noticed on this one, right when I cut it, that I left the bottom too thin. So that's how you make a bottle. You'll have to practice the collaring part quite a bit, but it's good practice for cylinders. So thanks for watching.